It's April 15th, 1987 in Dickson County, Tennessee. A teen gets done working her part-time job as a greeter at the Holiday Inn. Her twin brother picks her up to bring her home, but not long after they get on the road, they run out of gas. Luckily, a kind family notices and pulls over to help. Nervous to jump into a car with random people she doesn't know, she tells her brother to go with them to buy gas and says that she'll stay behind and wait for them to return. Little did she know that the real danger was in that decision, and when they returned just 9 minutes later, she was gone. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the abduction of Leanne Green. Martha Leanne Green was born on February 24, 1970, to parents Marjorie and George. She preferred to go by her middle name, so I'll be calling her Leanne throughout the rest of this episode. She had a twin brother named Lawson and two sisters, Lisa and Lori. Given the L theme of the family, I'm thinking that may have influenced the decision for her chosen name she went by. She was known to be a kind girl who loved her friends in her church, and she'd often be seen holding babies in the church nursery. Leanne and her family lived in White Bluff, Tennessee, and she had just gotten her first part-time job greeting people at the Holiday Inn a town over. At 17 years old, she had much to look forward to, not the least of which was prom for Dickson County High School, which was happening the very next day. She had been so excited for it, and she had laid out her pale pink dress and matching shoes, jewelry, and clutch out on her bed before she left for work that night on April 15th. At 9 p.m. on April 15th, 1987, her shift ended at the Holiday Inn at Highway 46 and Interstate 40 in Dickson, Tennessee. This Holiday Inn is no longer there, but there are many hotels that still are. Its location being one that intersects with many major thoroughfares makes it naturally a prime location for truck stops, hotels, and restaurants. That night, Leanne's twin brother Lawson had borrowed their cousin's car for prom the next night, and he was taking it for a little spin and test drive by picking up his sister from work that night. It was a 1979 Chevy Monte Carlo with tinted windows. So he did just that. And he picked up Leanne and hopped onto Highway 46 towards home in White Bluff. What he didn't realize was that this Monte Carlo had a faulty fuel gauge, and just a half mile up the road, the pair ran out of gas. The place they ran out of gas was next to a business called The Barn, near the intersection of Highway 46 and Fabric Road. I'll have a picture of the current day location up on my Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. But nowadays, it's a well-lit 4-lane highway. Back then, it was a dark 2-lane road. Lawson put on his hazard lights and popped the trunk to see if there was a gas can in there. Leanne felt uneasy. It was dark out and cold and rainy, and she didn't like the idea of having to walk with him in the dark to get gas or stay put. She told her brother, "I'm scared," and he said, "Well, why don't you just come with me to help me get gas?" But before they even had time to make that decision, a car pulled up behind them. It was a car of Good Samaritans, a family of 4, husband, wife, and 2 small children returning from church. The Puckett family had seen the flashing lights, and in this time before cell phones, they took a chance on stopping to see if whoever was on the side of the road needed some help. When they found out that it was 2 teens who were out of gas, they offered to take them to fill a gas can so they could be on their way. Likely because the car was about to be full once Lawson got into it, and suddenly not feeling as scared when the situation would just be her being by herself for a few minutes, Leanne made what was likely a fatal decision. She told her brother that rather than ride in the car with them to go get the gas, she would stay back and listen to music in the car for the few minutes she'd just be alone, and just leave her the keys. So Lawson said he'd be back in a minute, and Leanne locked herself in the car and waited. The Pucketts initially took Lawson up to a country store half a mile up the road in the same direction he was already headed, but it was closed, so they decided to circle back and head to the direction they had come from. You'll remember Leanne's workplace was at a truck stop type area, so there were plenty of gas stations and places to stop around. Lawson filled up the gas can at a Shell station back near the Holiday Inn, and within 9 minutes of leaving, he was back to the car. The car had tinted windows, so it wasn't odd that he didn't see anything when he first pulled up, plus it was really dark out. He was eager to get home, so he filled up the tank, which was located on the driver's side, and then walked to his driver's side door to get in. It was still locked, which probably surprised him a little because he would have figured that Leanne would have seen him arrive back and just unlocked it. So he knocked on the window to get her attention, but heard nothing. So he walked around to the passenger side, and that's when he noticed the door was open, but Leanne was not sitting there. There was no signs of any type of struggle, but her purse was still sitting on the seat as well as the keys. Here's a snippet of an interview done with him back at the time.
And I poured the gas in the car, and I went over to my side of the door and tried to open it, and it wouldn't unlock. So I looked in, and she was gone.
What happens next is a little unclear, and I just want to put that out there because no matter how far back I dug and what sources I looked into, I can't find out how Lawson got back home to tell his parents, but my assumption is that the Puckett family may have given him a ride. What I do know is that at 10 o'clock p.m., the family called police and met back at the car. The vibes of the police department were mixed. In the years following, some who were there at the beginning said that they were concerned about an abduction right away, particularly with her purse sitting there. Tennessee Sheriff's Association Executive Director Jeff Bledsoe was 19 years old and working the scene as a patrol officer on that night when Leanne disappeared, and he said in a 2022 interview, quote, "I could see no signs of a struggle, and her belongings in the car had me thinking she was expecting to return back to the car," end quote. Many of those who were part of the investigation early on were early in their careers and ended up in high-ranking law enforcement positions later on. They were still haunted about what happened to Leanne. I'll share some of their thoughts along the way. After combing through numerous interviews from the 80s through now, if I had to sum up my observations of the mindset of those working that night, it was that they felt off about it and suspected something bad happened, but they couldn't imagine it happening in their relatively safe community, so they looked for other explanations. Maybe she got out of the car impatiently and started walking towards her brother, or stepped out for fresh air and accidentally locked herself out, though there's mixed interviews about that. Some people say the door was open on her side, which that's what her own mother said, but others say that the car was locked up. Just a quick note though, it was very rainy that night, so it would have been miserable weather to just get out and start walking. But that thought process must have initially won out because they allowed the Green family to bring the car back home while they sent out officers to keep searching the immediate area. But when they didn't find Leanne just wandering the roadway, they changed their mind pretty quickly. They put together a full-scale search and took the car back into police custody and collected Leanne's belongings for evidence. But at this point, of course, the car had been rifled through, so the crime scene was tampered with. It wasn't a perfectly preserved crime scene to be processed, which was challenging, particularly since it was 1987, so they already had less technology and options to work with. 60 searchers looked all over the immediate area, but called off the physical search after just 3 days. The rescue wilderness chief of the Dickson County Rescue Squad, a man named Fritz Sander, said at the time, quote, "I could pretty much tell she's not in the area. We hit every place we thought was likely," end quote. In lieu of continuing the ground search, they had to pivot their strategy. They were asking any witness to come forward, and police were getting all major news stations and newspapers to relay what information they were looking for and how to be in touch.
We never want to expect anything like this to happen, but it happens other places, and it seems that now we have a bad situation right here.
One thing they made clear was that they believed this to be an abduction and not a runaway. Dickson County Sheriff's Deputy Jerry Hayes said, "We feel she's been abducted. She's not the type of girl to just run off." The phone lines for tips were ringing off the hook, but not producing anything very noteworthy. Dickson County Sheriff's dispatcher Jamie Heath told the Tennessean newspaper, quote, "Everything's a dead end. Everybody's seen something, but nobody's seen nothing. I wish I could tell you different." But a few days into the investigation, they did have one lead. A witness reported seeing a rust or wine-colored Ford pulled up next to the vehicle that evening, or rather near the vehicle. It's never been specifically said. My other question, though, is a Ford what? Ford makes a ton of vehicles, so the very least they could have said was if it was a truck or car for starters, but I digress. A month after Leanne's disappearance, the TBI created an official hotline just for this case. There was a number to call where you would give your name and phone number, and a detective would immediately be assigned to call you back. If you wished to remain anonymous, you stayed on the line until a detective could be located to speak with you. In the first few days, detectives said they received 6 or 7 calls that weren't particularly helpful, but stressed the importance of coming forward with any detail, and that no detail or memory was too small. A month into the investigation, investigators estimated that they had run down over 200 leads. TBI Special Agent John Carney said, quote, "There were some people who stopped and some individuals who were on the scene, and they have not come forward yet. They may have not bothered her and just gone on, and they could be from outside this area." Carney specified that that was the motivation for creating the toll-free number that was implemented. Around that same time, police worked with Lawson to do a reenactment of that evening. They parked a car in the same area and had him go through the steps, even driving to the closed country store, going to the Shell station, and coming back. It was then that they were able to determine that he was only gone for about 9 minutes, and based on other witness testimony and his own account of driving back past the car to get gas after the other location was closed, investigators were able to whittle down the window to only about 5 minutes that Leanne could have been abducted in. Which, I just want to pause and think about that for a moment, because so many of these cases, people will get tunnel vision and say, okay, but what are the odds that some predator just showed up in that tiny window of time? And this is just an example of, yes, that does happen. I've said before on this podcast, and I'll say it again, I'm never trying to make people live in fear and everybody thinking that someone's just lying in wait, waiting to abduct them. I just want to be objectively honest about the topic, and whenever the conversation is steered around, well, statistically, most people are killed by someone they know. And absolutely, that is what statistics will tell you and what is true, but that doesn't mean that this never happens. Unfortunately, it just means that intimate partner violence and crime at the hands of people you know is significant, to say the least. So absolutely, have that conversation. Just don't use it as your intro to dismiss this type of crime, because it does happen. And for every time it doesn't come to fruition, there are people out there who are determining if they want to act on their desire to commit this type of crime, and maybe they just don't that day. So I encourage people to evaluate their risks and safety strategies that they use based on this mindset. And I want to be careful. I'm not victim blaming here. The real strategy to prevent sexual assault and violence is to not sexually assault and commit violence. But because we live in a world where that isn't the case, where our society continues to embolden this behavior and dismiss it when it shows up, we have to make choices for ourselves knowing that this is the world we live in. It was the world we lived in back in 1987, and it's the world we live in now. Okay, stepping off my soapbox. Leanne's parents actually attended the reenactment. Her mom, Marjorie, felt it gave her some perspective she hadn't considered. The reenactment was done the exact same day of the week and exact same time. and Marjorie said she felt someone had to have seen something. She saw a number of cars passing by as she stood there. She assumed many were returning from church, which is what the Puckett family was doing when they stopped that night to help. The next lead would happen that summer when a man arrested for another crime started talking, and suddenly, a group of terrifying incidents began weaving together and leading police in a whole new direction. On July 22, 1987, a woman named Marcia Arrett left her shift at Jackson Madison General County Hospital at around 5:30 a.m. She was a labor and delivery nurse there. She headed southwest towards her home in Toone, Tennessee, on an isolated stretch of Tennessee Highway 18 South. I have a picture of what this road looks like on our Instagram. As she's driving along, she suddenly sees police lights behind her. She noticed it was a Dodge Ram pickup truck, which seemed a little odd to her, but ever the law-abiding citizen, she pulled over. A man in uniform came up to her truck. She saw a name tag that read Richards on it, and over his uniform, he had a black jacket with a Shelby County Fugitive Squad logo on it. When he began talking, he told her she was speeding and that she was under arrest, which is quite a dramatic escalation considering you normally just get a ticket and go on your way. He demanded she step out of the car, lock her car, and go with him. I imagine this all must have happened really quickly for her, and it's early in the morning, so there isn't a bunch of people out. As they moved back towards his pickup truck, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The woman was scared and objected to putting them on, and in that moment, he pulled out a gun and put it to her head. Getting closer to the supposed officer, she smelled alcohol in his breath and started to believe this wasn't an officer after all. She tried to maintain composure and reason with the man in control of the situation, even notating some of his license plate that she could make out. This went on for 20 minutes, and she started sensing that she needed to do something to not get put into that truck and taken to a second location. So, Marcia Arrett began screaming and motioning to passing motorists. This spooked the man, and he let her go, threateningly telling her not to mention the incident to anyone. She, of course, did not listen to that and went to police. She was able to pick a man from a photo lineup. His name? Robert McKinley Richards. So you might be wondering, why was his picture in a photo lineup? Great question. It's because he was already recently on police radar for other police impersonations and crimes. You see, he was cited just a month prior in the town of Germantown, Tennessee, after he began following a woman in his red truck. She was not employed by the hospital, but began driving nearby one, and that's when he started following her. She kept making turns and trying to lose him, and when she was convinced of it, she did not pull over, but did pull into a police station and report the incident. They tracked down the vehicle, and when they pulled him over, he told police he was a sheriff's deputy and flashed a badge. Peeking in, they noticed a loaded shotgun on the floor of the pickup. He also had a deputy's hat. When they began investigating into his employment, he admitted he lied about being a deputy. So police cited him for reckless driving, carrying a dangerous weapon, violation of a vehicle registration, and impersonating a police officer. They also breathalyzed him, but he blew below the legal limit, so they could not arrest him for that. So they issued the citations, and on his way he went. Then, just a week later, a 23-year-old St. Francis hospital nurse reports that a man broke into her house, handcuffed her, and raped her. Details she provides lead police to Richard's doorstep, and he is arrested, admits to the assault, and is charged with aggravated rape. But get ready to be enraged. He posts $10,000 bond, and he's released. So just to help you keep up with this timeline surrounding Robert Richards, this Germantown incident is June 1st, 1987. The sexual assault of the St. Francis Hospital nurse in her home is June 7th, 1987, and he attempts to abduct Marcia Arrett on July 22nd of 87. She then identifies him in a photo lineup on July 29th, and that's when things really break open. Out of nowhere, Richards confesses to 2 local crimes that have been perplexing investigators. The first is the abduction of St. Francis Hospital nurse Teresa Butler. I know this is audio, so you aren't seeing the spelling unless you're using captions, but in different newspapers, I see Teresa's name spelled with and without the H. I'm not sure exactly which one is correct, but on the Doe Network page, I see it without the H, so that's how I'll spell it. And I'll be posting a picture of where Teresa was driving on the Instagram, which is why I mentioned that. Teresa is a 23-year-old student nurse at the hospital and leaves her shift at 9 p.m. When she isn't home by 10, her husband drives her route to go looking for her and finds her car eerily abandoned on a rural stretch of road between 1 to 2 miles from their home. The car was still running, windshield wipers still working fast on this rainy night, lights still on, and her portable radio was still playing music on the front seat. A large-scale search turned up nothing, and now, on August 1st, 1987, 22-year-old Robert McKinley Richards was confessing. Now, something I want to point out, because obviously the case we're discussing in this podcast, I'm clearly about to be tying this back to Leanne. Since you're listening to this and don't have a map in front of you, I want to give some context to these Robert Richards incidents and crimes and give you some context about where they are. So St. Francis Hospital is in Memphis, and Germantown is also near Memphis. Leanne Green and the area of her home and the area of the abduction is about 2.5 hours away, closer to Nashville. Robert Richards did visit a friend in the town of Lyles around the time of Leanne's disappearance, which was not too far. But the majority of these instances happened around Memphis, which is nearby where Richards lived. The early morning attempted abduction of Marcia Arrett took place in between the two, though, around an hour or so northeast of Memphis. At the same time of his confession in Teresa Butler's abduction and murder, he also confessed to the abduction and murder of Leanne Green. In this next segment, I want to dig into the complicated enigma that is Robert Richards to better discuss his likelihood of being the person who did this. I want to thank the original reporting on this from the Tennessean, which is what I relied heavily on and linked in my show notes. Most of this information comes from Susan Thomas in a May of 1997 article. Robert McKinley Richards grew up in what was considered to be a very normal, stable, regular, upper-middle-class family. He was born July 11th, 1965, and was one of 3 children of Jewel and Jerry Richards. They owned a jewelry business, which made me laugh a little, just given Jewel's name, and they were considered a highly respected local business-owning family in this neighborhood in Memphis. But there was trouble behind closed doors. John Hudson, a clinical psychologist who would later spend 16 hours evaluating him, would go on to say, quote, "He grew up in a family environment of considerable unhappiness, which was also plagued by religious conflicts. Robert's mother is overprotective and vacillates between denying his problems and exaggerating them. His father appears to be an extremely rigid individual with considerable suspiciousness and religiosity, and apparently was rather abusive when Robert was a child." End quote. Robert Richards also shared that around age 13, he was the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of an adult male and other accomplices. Another claim he made to authorities is that when he was 8 or 9 years old, he witnessed an abduction and rape of a woman. A quote in the report said, "He said he saw a guy get a girl in his car after the guy waited down the street, and then the man pulled her over like he was the police." This is interesting considering this went on to be a common tactic Richards himself would use. Richard also stated that he felt that there was, quote, somebody else inside me. John Hudson would say in his conclusion of his report, quote, Mr. Richards has been an extremely difficult case to evaluate, in large part because he trusts no one and appears to be a chronic liar. He clearly has a mixed personality disorder with underlying features of hysteria, sociopathy, and dependency. Richard struggled as a boy to fit in and became increasingly withdrawn, often getting in trouble for acting out at school. At one time, he tried to light a classroom on fire. He dropped out of school as a teen, and then he began to abuse alcohol, as it was the only way he was ever seemingly able to somewhat interact normally with friends and peers. While he was under the influence of alcohol, that is when he would begin to impersonate professions of authority, very often that profession being law enforcement. But he also impersonated airplane pilots as well. He would really commit to this with uniforms and mastering the industry jargon and the like. His relationship grew strained with his parents during his 20s, and he spent a lot of time living with his maternal grandmother in the town of Bethel Springs. This is 100 miles east of Memphis. Authorities in both Shelby and McNairy counties both said that Richards expressed interest in joining the police forces, but it was very clear to them that he would never be a good fit and didn't have the skills or qualifications. On November 10th, 1986, that's when Teresa Butler went missing, and he actually immediately joined in the civilian search for her, something that if you followed a lot of true crime cases, you probably know is not that uncommon. Suspects will insert themselves into the investigation. Just a week later, on November 18th, Robert Richards found his own way into law enforcement. He began training as a Shelby County Reserve deputy. From there, he went all in. He purchased a Shelby County uniform, handcuffs, everything he could think to live out his fantasy as an officer. I do personally wonder how he got the exact Shelby County uniform, because that's how it's at least presented in several sources. I get that there are places you can just go buy police gear, but specific uniforms I feel like should be very locked down on how you acquire them, so I don't know. One of his ex-girlfriends said he wore all of this with such pride. She said he was dressed in spruce green pants, tan shirt, tie, the boots, fully equipped utility belt, a hat with the Sheriff's Department patch on it, and a windbreaker with the Sheriff's Department Fugitive Squad logo on it. She said he seemed just obsessed with getting law enforcement brotherhood and acceptance and camaraderie. It was in one instance when she was with him when he used his blue light to pull over some teen boys, accuse them of speeding, scare them, and then just laugh about it. She said she got a weird feeling about that, and she broke off their short-lived relationship. Little did she know, he had actually been kicked out of training he was doing months prior because of poor attendance. Another girlfriend of his shared that he had confessed about the 2 murders to her on a car ride one day. He described his best sexual experience being one where he stabbed a girl as he was raping her. The girl he described matched the description of Leanne Green. This girlfriend was so freaked out that she convinced him to take her to a friend's house, and then she refused to leave with him, breaking off the relationship. Shelby County Chief Deputy Ray Mills was the one who kicked him out of the trainings, and he said that Richards was absolutely fixated on being law enforcement, so much so that even after he went to prison, he offered to be an informant to police. Friends who knew him in the months before his arrest said that he had at least 3 uniforms, including an FBI hat. And despite being kicked out of the program, he had gained knowledge on the inner workings of law enforcement and how to pull people over. And despite not holding down a job, his friends said he always had hundreds of dollars of cash on him. This was never proven, but his friends alleged that he would pull people over, convince them of their violation, and then take cash as a bribe. Once he had this money, he was the type of person who bought everybody a round of drinks and was very, very flashy with his money. After his arrest, he ultimately was connected to and charged with raping 2 Memphis women and then the attempted abduction of Marcia Arrett. He was sentenced to 25-year prison sentences. So Richards was behind bars for those assaults, but the murder of Teresa Butler and Leanne Green, that wasn't so straightforward. There was no physical evidence connecting him to either crime scene. And over the next several years, he would confess and recant and confess and recant. Repeatedly, he would ride along with investigators to locations he claimed to have put the bodies, but the bodies have never been found. Still, most people believe he is who committed these crimes. Some investigators say that they are just certain of it, and that at one point he said he swore on his mother's grave that he killed Leanne. Leanne's mother even met with Richards in prison, who denied emphatically that he killed her daughter. As soon as the meeting ended, he allegedly went back to his cell and told his cellmate, "I think I convinced her that I didn't do it, but really I did." Those who were convinced of his guilt in Leanne's case said it's because he revealed two key pieces of information. One relating to her being on her menstrual cycle at the time, and one about a specific piece of jewelry she was wearing. These were things that weren't released to the press, but that investigators had knowledge of from the family. They also say it fits his MO, and that this would have been a reason that Leanne would have gotten out of the car. It would have been a terrible coincidence that Leanne Green happened to be sitting in a disabled vehicle in just a few short minutes of a window that a violent predator drove by. But back to what I was saying earlier, here's what Sheriff Mike Breedlove would later say about their investigation.
Over 1,000 leads were ran. 3 suspected serial murderers, rapists, were confirmed on Highway 46 that night.
Yes, you heard that right. 3 convicted serial killers or rapists were on that highway that night, confirmed. So yeah, guess that ups her risk just a little bit. On July 21st, 1991, Robert Richards convinced his cellmate of a conspiracy plot involving the CIA and said that they would both be killed unless his cellmate killed him first. Believing Richards' delusions, this cellmate murdered Robert Richards that day. With that, his cat and mouse game over the murders of Teresa and Leanne were over, and their families grieved that the answers died with him. One other case that police consider Richards a suspect in is just over the border into Beebe, Arkansas. A 20-year-old woman named Sandra Williams left her nursing shift and drove to her boyfriend's house on April 25th, 1987. After failing to show up, her charcoal gray 1984 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was found abandoned on the side of Arkansas Highway 31, about a half-mile north of Romance in White County. 2 weeks later, her body was discovered about 3 miles south of where her car had been located. She had been stabbed to death. I think this one is significant because it's shortly after Leanne's abduction, and it's in a similar fashion. Also, her body was found, so it just makes me wonder if that location was really searched further for possible clues and maybe even other bodies. Sandra Williams' case is still open and unsolved. While many people are set on Richard's guilt, and I agree he is a super strong suspect, I'm not completely sold. I'm not convinced he wouldn't fabricate this to continue to gain attention from law enforcement officials. The game of leading them to bodies and then the searches coming up empty seems part of all of that too. A mixture of control in a situation where he has none, and a way to still have some proximity and live out his fantasy life as being one of the guys on the police force. In the midst of all of these years and in the years after, there were some other leads worth mentioning. I apologize for moving the goalposts in the timeline here, but because Richards is considered the prime suspect, I wanted to tell his complete story all at once. So going back a couple of years while Richards was still alive, in March of 1989, a long-haul trucker drove himself to the parking lot of a VA hospital in Biloxi, Mississippi, and shot himself in the chest, attempting suicide. He survived, and in his possession, they found flyers about Leanne's disappearance and a few photos of a girl who resembled Leanne but ultimately was not her. He was questioned, but they didn't find anything tying him to the crime. Leanne's poster was distributed all over the country with flyers to take everywhere, and truck stops are common places to have these. It wouldn't be weird for truckers to take one since they drive all over the country, and it would be good for that type of person who's driving everywhere to have those so they can be on the lookout. So that lead didn't really amount to anything, and it was just sort of tabled. But speaking of truck and rest stops, there were a couple of sightings in the late 80s in both Virginia and Ohio. The accounts were similar of a girl using a restroom who looked like Leanne, who seemed pretty drugged or out of it, and not necessarily with her travel mate by her own free will. The Ohio one was pretty detailed and occurred in late September of 1988. A woman named Glenda, who was from Charlotte, North Carolina, had seen previous missing posters of Leanne and was familiar with the story. She was visiting relatives in Ohio. While doing so, she stopped at a roadside rest area on Interstate 75 and met what she described as a dark-haired, tired, and drugged-looking girl named Leanne in the bathroom. When she stopped at the rest area, she noticed a well-dressed man in his mid-30s standing outside the entrance to the women's bathroom, and she said she heard him say, "Leanne, are you still in there?" And the girl in the stall next to her said in a very tired voice, "Yes." When this witness went out to wash her hands, the girl came out of the stall and stood next to her washing her hands. The witness glanced up in the mirror and she saw that the girl next to her was looking at her. So she said, quote, I turned my head to the right and looked at her, and she's still looking at me. I thought, gee, this girl looks doped up, and gee, she looks familiar," end quote. The witness said that the man was still standing to the left of the women's restroom and that the girl came out, not in a hurried way, just slowly, like she was really tired. And at that point, he takes her and he pulls this girl sort of to the side. He grabs her left arm and then grabs her arm and makes her put it around his waist. He puts his right arm over her shoulder and they walk into this dark area of the parking lot where all the truckers usually park. There were no lights and it was pitch dark. This witness said, when he grabbed her, I knew who she was. The account in Virginia was similar, though the Ohio one is the only one I heard mention Leanne as her name, which I personally find odd that this supposed abductor wouldn't have her go by an alias given the publicity of this case. But this gave her parents hope, and at the time, Marjorie said this gave her all she needed to believe her daughter was still alive and out there. In 1993, Marjorie Green went on the Jerry Springer show. She said she didn't really believe in psychics, but wanted to keep her daughter's story out there and wanted to try anything she could. The psychic suggested that she was being held against her will, drugged, and trafficked. No, this is years after the sightings at the rest stops were published and very available to the psychic to read and draw her own conclusions from the paper. By this point, Marjorie wasn't convinced. She said she didn't believe the psychic and she believed her daughter was dead. Police spoke of a man named Travis McGuire and named him as a suspect. He killed a woman in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area after he abducted her from a parking lot, and he had ties to the area Leanne went missing from at the time of her disappearance. They named him in the early 1990s as one of two prime suspects, but they emphasized that Richards was their prime suspect and they believe he carried out the murder. Police also referenced another man who they wouldn't name then or now, who they said had a long history of violence towards women and was suspected in the disappearance of a local Girl Scout. Me being nosy, I tried to find cases of missing Girl Scouts from the area and did find one who later had somebody arrested for it. But if that is the same case, it couldn't have been the perpetrator of Leanne's crime because this person was in prison for every single year except the 1 year that this Girl Scout was abducted. So I don't know that it's the same person. It's just something that was reported on. In 1992, a homeowner called police when their dog brought a large amount of human hair back to them with a bobby pin in it, which I can't imagine how startling that would be as a homeowner. I know that dogs bring things like dead squirrels and things like that back, but Seeing a huge clump of human hair had to be terrifying. This was in Burns, Tennessee, a town over from White Bluff where Leanne Green lived. Police poured through the field and they actually found bones. They thought for a moment that they may have found Leanne, but when they sent the bones off to be tested, it was found out that they were animal bones, and the hair was not a match to Leanne's from her hairbrush. So with that, they were at another dead end. But they did continue police and civilian volunteer searches in that area because if not Leanne, the hair still had to come from someone. But nothing was ever found. Into the mid-90s, Leanne Green's mother Marjorie developed cancer. When it was found to be terminal, Mike Breedlove visited her one last time and had an interesting request that he later shared in a Channel 2 news interview.
I said, Ms. Green, will you do something for me? When you do, will you please come back to me? I don't care if you haunt me in the middle of the night. Just give me something that I can go on so I can find her remains. And you know, we laughed about it. She goes, okay, I will. You know, but it's just one of those where it is going to be, if it goes unresolved. I'm just hoping someone somewhere will find her remains.
I tend to have a dark sense of humor, so I appreciated that they were able to find some humor in such tragedy, especially towards the end of her life. Marjorie Green died in 1997, years into a legal battle to declare her daughter dead that wouldn't happen until after her own death. She died without ever having any answers, though she was one who very much believed she knew who the killer was. She felt after leaving Richard's jail cell that day that she knew he was the killer, and she went to her grave convinced of it. Over the years, her family shared the ways in which they tried to move on with their lives. For weeks after her disappearance, they left her prom dress laid out on her bed with all of her accessories before deciding to put it away. They left her room as it was for a year before turning it into a spare bedroom. They decided to hold a memorial service for her in October of 1992 to try to get some form of closure, whatever that means and whatever that looks like. At the time of her memorial service, Marjorie shared how her family members had been hospitalized from the stress. She talked about losing 17 pounds herself. Her husband kept busy, so busy that he would just go and go and go until he could fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. Lawson largely blamed himself despite his family's pleas for him not to do so. Her family petitioned to have her declared dead in 1994, but as I mentioned, a legal battle ensued and she would not be declared dead until 1999, 12 years after she went missing. The case was discussed often throughout the years, but no major new leads arose. In 2020, the TBI put out a new video trying to generate leads and offering some insight that maybe there are answers out there that don't lie with Robert Richards. Perhaps there is another explanation, and maybe someone who knew Leanne back then could help.
But there still could be people out there that saw something, or maybe even talked to her a few days before prior hand, maybe somebody that was bothering her, or that she just didn't feel right about, and that's what we want to keep diving into further.
I think you can make of that what you will. He could be referencing maybe there was someone at school, but I also think about that area she worked in, which had a lot of transient people in the form of people coming through as truckers and just passing by the area for a while. And maybe there was somebody at her job who was bugging her. That is an area in the hotel and hospitality industry where you get a lot of interesting people you encounter, and she was a young, pretty girl, so you never know. In early 2023, George Green also died at the age of 91, having never learned what happened to his little girl. But her siblings and extended family are still out there, and still hoping that someone can lead them to answers in Leanne's case and help them move it forward. The investigators who've worked tirelessly on this case desperately want that as well.
Leanne was somebody's child, just like anybody else in a similar case such as this. We want to bring her home. We want answers for her family, and we also want answers for the community.
If Leanne was still alive at the time of this recording, she would be 54 years old. She was last seen wearing a white t-shirt, mid-calf length faded jeans, and white high-top Reebok sneakers. She has green eyes but wears brown contacts. She was 5'5" and 120 pounds with fair skin, brown curly hair, and, as I said, she's sometimes listed as having brown eyes, but she naturally has green. If you have any information on Leanne Green's disappearance, you can reach out to the Dixon County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigations Division at 615-789-4130 or tips@dixoncounty.net. You can also call the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-TBI-FIND. This has been a Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review, tell your friends, and follow us on social media. I also take case suggestions at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening.